He walked into his own dealership, dressed like an average customer, just to see how they treated people. They mocked him, ignored him, and sent him to the pre-owned lot, until he made one phone call that changed everything. The showroom smelled like polished leather and fresh coffee. Soft jazz played through discreet ceiling speakers, blending with the quiet hum of whispered conversations and the faint clicking of expensive shoes on marble floors. Jonathan Rees stood near a sleek silver coupe, running a hand over its aerodynamic curves. He wasn't in a rush. He had time. But the employees didn't seem to think he was worth any. A young salesman in a fitted navy suit glanced in his direction, eyes flicking over Jonathan's simple polo and jeans. His expression barely concealed his disinterest. With a slight shake of his head, he turned away, walking toward a couple stepping out of a luxury SUV. Jonathan exhaled through his nose, amused. He had seen this type of behavior before, but amusement faded when he realized not a single employee had acknowledged him. He leaned against the car, watching as a man in a tailored suit strode in, adjusting the gold cufflinks on his crisp white shirt. Immediately, the sales team reacted. "Welcome, sir. What brings you in today? We've got an excellent selection in the VIP showroom. Would you like a glass of champagne while we prepare a test drive?" The man chuckled, nodding along. As the employees scrambled over each other to assist him, Jonathan folded his arms. It wasn't the service that bothered him. It was the contrast 30 minutes. That's how long he had been standing there watching, waiting. Finally, he decided to test something. He took a step toward the reception desk, offering a polite smile. "Excuse me?" The receptionist, a woman in her late 20s, with perfectly straightened hair and an air of detached professionalism, barely glanced at him. "Sales reps are busy," she said flatly. "You can wait outside if you're just looking." Jonathan tilted his head outside. She tapped at her keyboard, uninterested. "Yes, sir. We try to keep the showroom clear for serious buyers. We can schedule an appointment if you're actually interested in purchasing." The words weren't just dismissive. They were a judgment. Jonathan's grip tightened around the edge of the desk. His patience was long, but this was getting ridiculous. Before he could respond, another salesman, an older man with salt and pepper hair and a name tag that read Ron, stepped up. He didn't smile, didn't offer a greeting, sir. This dealership caters to a certain clientele. His eyes traveled down to Jonathan's scuffed sneakers before meeting his gaze again. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Jonathan held his stare. "Are you?" A flicker of irritation crossed Ron's face before he forced a tight-lipped smile. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at our pre-owned lot. We have excellent financing options, if that's a concern." Jonathan let the insult settle between them. He could feel the attention of other employees now, not because they wanted to have him, but because they wanted him gone. This was no misunderstanding. This was deliberate. He nodded slowly, as if considering their words. He glanced back toward the well-dressed customer, now sipping champagne while a salesman practically polished his shoes with compliments. Jonathan exhaled, reaching into his pocket for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, found the number he was looking for, and pressed call. It rang twice before a deep voice answered. "I need you here now." Jonathan ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. The employees had no idea who they had just dismissed, but they were about to find out. Jonathan Rees hadn't always been a man people ignored. Growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio, he had learned the value of hard work, the way most kids in his neighborhood did. By necessity, his mother worked double shifts as a nurse. His father ran a small auto repair shop that barely stayed afloat. At 15, Jonathan spent his weekends under the hood of old cars, learning how engines breathed, how transmissions carried weight, how a well-tuned machine could command respect just by the sound of its idle. But cars weren't the only thing he learned about. He learned about perception, about the way people judged others, before a single word was spoken. His father had a client, Mr. Dawson, a well-off businessman, who always pulled up in a spotless black Cadillac. Jonathan remembered how differently people treated him, offering him the best seat, rushing to serve him, laughing a little too hard at his jokes. But one day Mr. Dawson came in wearing work clothes, his Cadillac in the shop, driving a rusted pickup, and suddenly he wasn't Mr. Dawson anymore. He was just another guy that stuck with Jonathan. By the time he was 25, he had saved up enough to open a small used car dealership. He ran it with one rule: every customer gets treated the same. Whether they drive a Bentley or a busted Honda, People respected that his business grew. By 30, he had expanded across 3 states. By 42, he was the owner of one of the most successful luxury automotive chains in the country. And yet he never changed the way he dressed, never flaunted his wealth, because to him it was never about the money, it was about the principle, which was exactly why he was standing inside one of his own dealerships, dressed in a polo and jeans, getting treated like he didn't belong. This wasn't the first time he had done this. Jonathan made it a habit to visit his businesses, unannounced, always as a customer. It was his way of keeping people honest. Because anyone could put on a show for the boss, what mattered was how they acted when they thought no one was watching. And right now they were. Failing that test, as he stood near the reception desk, the sales team still ignoring him, Jonathan thought about how easily these employees dismissed people like him, how many others had walked in and been treated like this, how many potential customers had been pushed away because they didn't look the part. He glanced toward the man in the suit again, still receiving royal treatment, then back at the employees, who had told him to wait outside. Jonathan had built this empire on respect, and in the next few minutes, he was about to remind them why that mattered. Jonathan remained quiet, letting the moment stretch. The employees had already dismissed him. They assumed he was nothing more than a window shopper, wasting their time, but a man in a dark blue suit had just walked through the glass doors, adjusting the gold cufflinks on his crisp white sleeves. And suddenly, the energy in the room shifted. 3 salesmen immediately perked up, their conversations cutting short as they moved toward him with practiced enthusiasm. "Good afternoon, sir. What brings you in today? We just got in a new shipment of imports. Might be exactly what you're looking for. Would you like a glass of champagne?" While we discuss options, Jonathan watched as the man smirked, clearly enjoying the attention. He wasn't carrying anything, hadn't even said a word yet, but the staff had already decided. This man belonged here. A younger salesman, barely in his 20s, glanced at Jonathan before lowering his voice to his co-worker. "You can always tell who's serious and who's just killing time." Jonathan pretended not to hear. He took a slow step toward one of the sports cars. On display, a sleek, jet black convertible with a sticker price of $320,000. He reached for the door handle. A sharp voice cut through there. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you not to touch that." Jonathan turned. It was Ron, the older salesman, who had barely spared him a glance earlier. "We keep the showroom cars pristine for customers who are serious about buying." Ron continued, his voice firm. "If you're just looking, I can direct you to something more accessible." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Accessible?" Ron's smile was tight. "We have a pre-owned section a few miles down the road. Lower payments, better financing options." Jonathan let the words settle. They weren't suggestions. They were dismissals. He glanced back toward the well-dressed man in the suit, now sitting comfortably inside a brand new vehicle, running his hands over the leather-wrapped steering wheel as a salesman detailed the car's features with practiced enthusiasm. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Jonathan turned back to Ron. "Let me get this straight. You haven't asked if I have an appointment, haven't asked what I do for a living, haven't asked if I'm here to buy." His voice remained calm even. "But you've already decided I don't belong here." Ron didn't even flinch. "So we cater to a very specific clientele. You understand?" Jonathan smiled. "I think I do." Ron nodded, mistaking Jonathan's calm demeanor for acceptance. But Jonathan wasn't accepting anything. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. It rang twice. "I need you here," he said simply now, and then he hung up. The employees had no idea what was about to happen, but they were about to learn. Jonathan tucked his phone back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. The employees went back to ignoring him, their attention still on the well-dressed man, who was now laughing as he accepted a glass of champagne from a grinning salesman. Ron, satisfied that Jonathan had gotten the message, turned away without another word. Jonathan exhaled slowly, glancing toward the glass doors, and then it happened. A sleek, black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up to the entrance, its polished body reflecting the afternoon sun. The car was impeccable, the kind of machine that only a select few could afford. The valet rushed forward to open the rear door. A tall man in a charcoal suit stepped out, his presence immediately commanding attention. He adjusted his cufflinks, scanning the room through the glass. Before pushing open the doors, the showroom fell silent. Employees who had spent the last hour ignoring Jonathan were now standing up straighter, smoothing their suits, adjusting their ties. Ron, the salesman, who had told Jonathan to check out the pre-owned lot, visibly stiffened. The suited man walked with purpose, his leather shoes tapping against the marble floor. And then he locked eyes with Jonathan and smiled. Every employee in the room watched in confusion as the man crossed the showroom floor, not toward the well-dressed customer they had been doting on, but straight to Jonathan. "Sir," the man said, his tone respectful apologies for the delay. Jonathan nodded as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But the employees, they looked like they had just seen a ghost. Ron took a step forward, his confusion quickly shifting to panic. I'm sorry," he stammered, addressing the suited man. "I don't believe we've met." The man turned toward Ron, his face unreadable. "I'm David Langford, regional manager." His voice was calm but carried weight. "And I believe you're the one I'm here to see." The air in the showroom shifted. Ron's face went pale. The other employees were now frozen in place, their eyes darting between Jonathan and David, trying to piece together what was happening. Jonathan let the silence stretch before finally speaking. "So, tell me," he said, his voice cool, deliberate. "This is how we treat people here." The weight of those words hit like a hammer. The sales staff stumbled over themselves, trying to explain. "Sir, we didn't realize this is all a misunderstanding." But there was no misunderstanding. The damage was already done, and now it was time for consequences. The air inside the showroom shifted from polished confidence to pure anxiety. Ron swallowed hard, his hands twitching at his sides, as he tried to process what was happening. David Langford, regional manager, and he had just walked in and greeted Jonathan. Like an old friend, the other employees stayed frozen, their smiles long gone, their backs suddenly straighter. Even the receptionist, who had barely looked up when Jonathan first spoke, was now staring at him, like he had just transformed into someone else entirely. Jonathan didn't say anything right away. He let the moment stretch, his gaze drifting over each of them, calm, composed, unreadable. Then, in a voice that was dangerously even, he asked one simple question. This is how we treat people here." Ron's mouth opened, but no words came out. He glanced at his co-workers, as if waiting for someone to jump in and save him. No one did. David didn't either. He just folded his hands in front of him, watching the sales team like a school principal, waiting for an explanation. Ron tried forcing a nervous laugh. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, a misunderstanding." Ron nodded quickly, grasping at anything that might help him escape the situation. "Absolutely, you see, we deal with a very particular clientele here. We try to ensure the best experience for..." Jonathan cut him off with a quiet chuckle. A particular clientele. Ron hesitated, realizing too late that he had just dug himself deeper. The showroom felt smaller now. The champagne glasses, the spotless cars, the crisp suits, it all seemed meaningless in the weight of the moment. Jonathan turned his head slightly, looking toward the well-dressed man, still lounging inside the luxury car. How much attention did this man get when he walked in? No one answered. Jonathan shifted his eyes back to Ron. "And how much did I get?" Ron fidgeted, his face turning a shade redder by the second I look. "Sir, we didn't know you didn't know who I was." Jonathan finished for him. He nodded slowly, letting the truth of it settle over the room. He turned toward David, now addressing him directly. "Tell me, how much do we make in sales at this location?" David didn't hesitate. "This dealership brings in roughly $28 million annually." Jonathan looked back at the stunned employees. "That's $28 million, he repeated. "And yet some of you have decided for yourselves who is and isn't worth your time." No one breathed. Jonathan stepped forward, closing the space between himself and Ron, but not in a threatening way, in a way that made it clear he was in control. Ron visibly shrank. What would have happened? Jonathan asked. "If I really had been just another customer, what if I had been someone looking to spend $500,000 today? Would you have let that money walk out the door?" Ron had no answer, but Jonathan didn't need one. The damage was done, and now the reckoning was about to begin. Silence suffocated the showroom. No one dared to speak, move, or even shift under Jonathan's gaze. Ron's confidence had completely evaporated. The other employees weren't much better, stiff, wide-eyed, waiting for the inevitable. Jonathan exhaled, slowly shaking his head, disappointed but not surprised. David finally spoke, his tone sharp, professional. "Mr. Reese, How would you like to proceed? Ron's head snapped up, the color drained from his face. Mr. Reese, there was no denying it anymore. No backpedaling, no recovering. The man they had mocked, dismissed and pushed aside wasn't just any customer. He was the owner. Jonathan looked around at the employees, who had spent the last hour treating him like he didn't belong. Then, his voice low but firm, he said, "I want names." David nodded. "Immediately, I already have them." The weight of that statement sent a ripple of panic through the staff. The receptionist's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The younger salesman, who had whispered about who's serious and who's just killing time, looked ready to pass out, and Ron, he was shaking his head, still trying to salvage the moment. "Sir, please?" He started stepping forward. We made a mistake. We were just trying to keep things running smoothly." Jonathan lifted a hand, and Ron stopped talking immediately. "I've been in this business for almost 20 years, Jonathan said, his voice calm but carrying undeniable authority. "And in that time, I've learned something very simple. Respect doesn't cost a damn thing." The words landed like a punch. Jonathan continued, his tone never rising, but carrying more weight than if he had yelled. "You all looked at me and made a decision." He said, "You assumed I wasn't worth your time. You assumed I couldn't afford to be here, and you treated me like I was beneath you." He let the words sink in before adding, "And if you did that to me, I can only imagine how many actual customers. You've done it to no one had an argument. No one had a defense because Jonathan was right." David turned to the staff, his face blank, his voice void of sympathy. "Effective immediately," he said. "Everyone involved in today's incident is terminated." The words hit like a hammer. Ron's mouth dropped open. "Wait, you can't. This is not up for discussion." David interrupted. "We don't run our business like this." The younger salesman took a step back, as if trying to physically escape what was happening. The receptionist looked like she was holding back tears. Ron tried again, desperation seeping into his voice. "Please, this was just a misunderstanding. We didn't mean." "You didn't mean what?" Jonathan asked, his expression unreadable. "Didn't mean to get caught." Ron had no response. Jonathan sighed, running a hand over his jaw. He had seen enough. He turned to David. "Make sure the rest of the team gets a company-wide memo." David nodded, "Absolutely." Jonathan glanced around one last time, a final look at the people who had judged him so quickly, and then, in a tone so quiet it cut deeper than any raised voice, he left them with one final statement. "This isn't about the money. It never was." He let that settle, then added, "It's about respect." And with that, he turned and walked toward the exit. Behind him, the weight of their failure settled in, and for those left standing, a lesson had been learned the hard way. Jonathan stepped outside, the warm afternoon air washing over him. As he adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, the weight of what had just transpired inside the showroom didn't linger on him. It wasn't his burden to carry. Behind him, through the glass doors, he could see the aftermath unfolding. Ron stood paralyzed, his mouth still slightly open, as if his brain refused to accept reality. The younger salesman had slumped against the counter, silent and stunned. The receptionist had turned away, covering her face with one trembling hand. And David, he was already making calls, ensuring that Jonathan's orders were carried out. Immediately, a valet rushed forward, startled when he recognized Jonathan. "Sir, can I get your car for you?" Jonathan turned, glancing at him. Unlike the others, this young man hadn't looked down on him. He had done his job, no arrogance, no bias. Jonathan reached into his pocket, pulling out a $100 bill. "You handled yourself well, Dave." The valet hesitated, his eyes darting toward the dealership. "I thank you, sir. I just treat everyone the same." Jonathan smiled faintly. "That's exactly why you're going." The valet nodded, quickly stepping back as a black Mercedes, Maybach 680, pulled up to the curb. The driver, a man in his 50s, wearing a sharp navy suit, stepped out and opened the door. "Mr. Reese," he said with a small nod. Jonathan slid into the back seat, the soft leather molding around him. As the door closed, he looked back one last time at the dealership, at the faces that had judged him, the panic now setting in. Some lessons were learned the easy way. Others, they came at a cost. The Maybach pulled away, blending into the smooth flow of traffic. Inside the car, Jonathan leaned back, exhaling through his nose. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about setting a standard. Because if people only respect wealth when they can see it, then they don't respect people at all. And in his business, that kind of mindset had no place. Respect isn't something you reserve for the people you think are important. It's something you give to everyone. Because in the end, you never know who you're really talking to. If you believe in treating people with fairness, regardless of their background, drop a comment below. Have you ever experienced something like this? Share your story. Let's keep this conversation going. And if you want more stories like this, hit that subscribe button. Because the best lessons, they come from real moments like these.